So welcome to today's talk, as you can see here, on the end of autumn. And I'm going to take a close look at three interpretations of this season by late Victorian artists. I think in some of the billing for this event, I did use the term pre-Raphaelite artist, but they're not so much. So I'm sticking to my guns on late Victorian. And this is the first image that I wanted to talk about today and to share with you. An absolutely sort of wonderful rendering of autumn. And we see very clearly in it a very kind of accurate, realistic depiction of the effects of light during this season. And it's really that was the focus for this artist. Everything about it absolutely directs our eye into the imagery and to this beautiful golden haze on the horizon line in the back of the picture. And as you can see there, the title of this painting is Autumn Glory. So we have this glorious light that's really being celebrated. The composition of this painting is very typical of the work of this artist, John Atkinson Grimshaw. We've got a source of light on the horizon that's really flanked by all of the imagery of the landscape that he was living in. So here we have this beautiful tree-lined road, the trees themselves absolutely sort of stunningly silhouetted against that golden light, as their leaves have been shed and create this beautiful orange-coloured carpet that again drifts off into that melting point of that beautiful horizon line where all the perspective lines disappear to as we look at that painting. On the house we have these beautiful chimneys of quite a Gothic-looking building, and on the right-hand side there you'll see a couple of figures, and that was again quite typical of this artist's work to include usually a female figure within this urban landscape. But as well as, you know, I've just said this was a realist artist, so I do think that his reason for using autumn is very different to two of the other artists we'll look at. And for him, it's very much a celebration of light. He's actually most famous for and most well known for his moonlight scenes of urban landscapes, and you can see that this painting shares a lot of the features with the one we've just looked at. We have that single female figure, we've got all of these sort of wonderful vertical arrangements leading our eyes down to that horizon line, which is absolutely exemplified here by the bridge, Westminster Bridge in London, cutting right across the middle of the painting there, again leading our eyes towards that light source of the crescent moon. And in these moonlight pictures, Atkinson Grimshaw was able to very much experiment with beautiful blue colours and a crepuscular light that comes from that moonlight, and the effects of that on water and how he can use that to evoke the feelings of perhaps this quite chilly evening through the blue colours. But in his autumn pictures, he does do something quite different whilst using the same compositional indicators, as we can see in the difference between those two paintings. So who was John Atkinson Grimshaw? Here's a picture of him, a rather dandy-looking chap, but also quite artistically ruffled, as you often kind of can see in these pictures of male artists from his time. So quite an unkempt beard and hairdo for him there. And he was an artist who was born in Leeds to very sort of humble origins. His father was a postman, and he became a self-taught artist. Another kind of aspect of his personal life that comes up quite often is that he went on to marry his first cousin, Francis Hubbard, but they did have a happy marriage and a number of children between them. He apparently did that to the dismay of his parents, and perhaps something to kind of to get out of that, like I said, quite humble origin he was born into, that working class lifestyle. It seemed like he was someone who wanted to do something a little bit different, and in becoming an artist he certainly did. He had worked at the Great Northern Railway, but he left that to become an artist, and just 29 years of age he exhibited his first painting, which were often some birds, fruit, still life, that sort of thing, but he found patronage under the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society. He's often referred to as a kind of late pre-Raphaelite painter. This catch-all term is sort of what pre-Raphaelitism has become, meaning late Victorian artist. But to me, he's more of a British impressionist, and that again is because of his real interest in light and the effects of light, not only on his subjects, but how he can capture those in his paintings to communicate different emotions with his audiences. The great painter James McNeill Whistler knew Grimshaw and stated, "I consider myself the inventor of nocturnes until I saw Grimmy's moonlight pictures." So you can tell they're sort of quite good friends, that wonderful use of the nickname Grimmy in that sense from Whistler. But also I would certainly consider Whistler the inventor of nocturnes, and by which I mean the sort of capturing the effect of moonlight. But as we've seen with Atkins and Grimshaw's pictures, he was sort of very astute artist in doing that as well. In order to teach himself to paint, Atkins and Grimshaw came at this from a background of not having any experience in direction in artistry. So he was pitching himself alongside lots of the London scene artists who had worked from the antique sculpture and the antique model, and of course from life drawing as well. And perhaps there was something in that that directed him more towards landscapes and more of an evocation of realism, rather than using correct symbols or spaces or figures in the same way as some of his contemporaries did. And it was the camera obscura that he used to teach himself to paint accurately. And really that kind of love of realism and capturing something exact came from his love of photography. He used a camera obscura, so his interest in the science behind the camera and the photography he was using is also evident in that. Now, I've put some images up here, not of Atkins and Grimshaw, but just some images pulled from Google of what a camera obscura is and how it works. So through a blackened window, a hole is made into a dark room, and what this does is force the light in through a tiny hole in order to depict that image, the image of the outside world as it looks, upside down on the wall opposite. And this is how Atkins and Grimshaw came to have that beautiful sense of depth and realism in those landscape pictures that we've seen. So this is exactly how he would set himself up with his canvas on the wall. And of course, once the outline has been complete, the canvas can be turned upside down, and back in the studio, that rich colour can be added. So I hope that makes sense. The camera obscura, it should be said, was also widely used by artists such as Caravaggio and Vermeer, often renowned again for their use of light. So I think there can be a lot said in the fact that artists who are interested in portraying the effects of light on their subjects are also interested in how light can be used to create those compositions and those paintings. It's all quite linked, isn't it? This did create some criticism of Atkins and Grimshaw's work, as some of his contemporaries were doubtful as to whether these could be called paintings, and almost felt a bit put out, I think, by the fact, is this cheating if you're tracing this line? But I think to come up with this method yourself and teach yourself how to paint in the first instance is to be commended, really. In 1870, Atkins and Grimshaw and his wife moved here to Nostrop Old Hall in just outside of Leeds. And you can see, I think, the resounding resemblance from this beautiful neo-Gothic building to the turrets and towers and chimneys that we saw in Autumn Glory. This is more realistic rendering of it done by Atkins and Grimshaw, I think, for his own reference. The family moved out here, like I said, in 1870, and it was a wonderful family home that they really sort of enjoyed living in, and that he sort of gave a wonderful upbringing and education to his children, 4 of whom became artists themselves. So I think that shows a real nurturing in his children, his own passion. But what we see here, if we look very closely at the difference between these two depictions of Nostrop Old Hall, is how when Atkins and Grimshaw was painting for the wider market, and more to experiment with these effects of daylight. The realism of the building itself has almost sort of disappeared, and I would attribute a lot of that to his use of colour. We have these beautiful, rich, warm tones of the wonderful autumnal hues, not just from the leaves, as we kind of think about autumn as it being that gives us our colour, but also very famously yet from the light coming from the horizon line on this painting. But then if we look closely, the contrasting colours of quite blue-toned greens, particularly in this wonderful ivy that spans the building, have been used to add an interest and a depth and a shadow. And I think that's particularly astute from this artist when we look at how the shadows have been added to the recesses here and in the windows across the buildings, and how that really does add to that depth by the artist's use of contrasting colours. I've had a comment in the chat box that sound has been lost. Is that for everybody? Okay, Martin, if you can hear me, it looks like that might just be your sound, so please do check your microphone. Not microphone, your speakers. Bear with me 1 second. Thank you, everybody, and apologies for that short introduction. There's just no point me continuing if nobody can hear me. So we'll leave it there. That was the point I really wanted to make about Autumn Glory. Is so when you sort of zoom deep down into this painting, I think you can really get a sense of how intelligent the artist was in his approach to putting these pictures together, and I think that will give you a bit of a sense as well as to why I personally think of him more as an impressionist, a British impressionist, as the way he applies the paint to add very clear depth, interest and texture to the surface really helps us to understand how the light works on those range of surfaces in his own paintings. Here's another evocation of Nostrop Old Hall by the same artist, but quite a different approach here to that very similar subject. So all those elements that we talked about in Autumn Glory are apparent in Autumn Gold, and you can tell from the titles there, the artist was trying to do a very similar thing. We have the wonderful light source coming at us over the horizon, highlighted by the balustrade and the wall in the garden, and again these beautiful trees silhouetting and adding a vignette to the picture that really directs our focus and our attention. However, once again, when we really zoom in on this painting, we can see that there's been quite a different approach to how the paint is used. This is a different method. This is oil painting on panel, which gives a much flatter, smoother finish to any painting, as opposed to oil on canvas, so a woven surface, as we saw in the previous image. I should just say, when I say panel, that means a wooden panel that's been prepared to take the paint. However, these tiny little highlights that Grimshaw uses are particularly effective, again, on the trees, to show these sort of wonderful leaves, and that gives an indication of how the light might be appearing dappled on the floor. And we get a lovely sense of that on the path, as we can imagine the light coming through the trees. And then again, that beautiful evergreen ivy, adding a very different, sort of much cooler palette for a contrast to the very warm tones that he's used in the sky, again giving us a wonderful depth to this picture. Atkinson Grimshaw also used this sort of motif as autumn in quite a very sort of starkly different way to that realism. And here we have the figure of Dame Autumn having a mournful face, and I think this gives a bit of an indication that this artist was willing to be experimental. This picture was painted at the same time as the two previous images that we've seen. However, he's imagined the season as this dancing nymph, absolutely sort of coming to us as an apparition in the middle of this beautiful bracken, woody landscape. There's a very faint glimmer of Nostrop Hall perhaps being behind the trees here. As you can see the shape and the outline of the building and all this wonderful light coming through the windows. But once again, to my mind, even though it's a symbolist apparition of something quite mystic and magical, it's still the play of light that the artist is interested in. And we can see that in this, the haloed figure being presented with very, very light paint, with a blue mist around her, which adds absolute stark contrast to this autumnal ground behind her. Another of Atkinson Grimshaw's paintings, again, these similar characteristic features that you start to see of how he embeds architecture and nature together in his landscapes. But we have the figure here of mournful autumn, and again, sort of maybe an indication that he was using the season not just for its artistic effects, but for something a little bit more personal. So the second painting and artist that I wanted to look at today in this session on autumn is John Everett Millais. And here we have his 1856 painting, Autumn Leaves. An absolutely sort of iconic Millais painting, which is in Manchester Art Gallery's collection. It's an autumnal garden scene, and we see four kind of melancholy looking young girls there around this mound of leaves. I think it's quite interesting that this mound is quite stationary, quite stagnant, quite dominant in the landscape, and the girls are standing around it quite close together, but yet not really interacting either with it or with each other. And that's very much through this gaze that each of them has, either directly kind of past us as a viewer or within the picture frame. So it really is a very complex and dynamic arrangement of the figures, but has a sturdiness and a stillness to it, as these girls and the trees and the pile of leaves itself almost act as columns, and make it quite almost that all these things are acting in separate spheres. So I have a girl holding a wicker basket there on the left, just behind the pile of leaves, and you can see the smoke coming off the top of that, as though it's perhaps going to be on fire or has been on fire, but yet the leaves are sitting fresh on top of that. So there's some interest there that almost gives us a tease that this isn't a representative or realistic rendering of the season, or of this fire. We're sort of left wondering whether it's a fire or not. We also have a girl of interest here in the bottom right-hand corner, very different coloured clothes to the other two. It's almost uncomfortable as a viewer to watch her and the one behind her in the very light brown robes. In this composition, it almost would feel more comfortable if those two figures were cropped out of it completely, and we would get a certain balance and symmetry from the girls in the dark green dresses, and that lovely hourglass shape that sits between them from the leaves up to the sky. So I do think that was probably intentional from this artist and what he was trying to capture, and what all of these different elements kind of hold as a symbolic meaning. So that's the next aspect of autumn that I'm going to come on to. We've seen someone who is interested in light, and I think this is someone that Millais, as the artist we've moved on to, is an artist who's quite interested in using his artwork to negotiate his own meanings and ideas. The location is actually a real one. It's set in a garden in a location now occupied by Rodney Gardens in Perth in Scotland, where Millais was familiar with and spent a lot of time. So here's the artist in question, responsible for this painting, John Everett Millais. Probably needs little introduction to the audience today, but who was a founder member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. I think what's extraordinary in him, in sort of coming to this picture and this rendition of autumn, is his depiction of the children and how sort of accurate that is. They look like children, and that is something that artists can sometimes often have difficulty with. But we know that Millais was a particularly fantastic artist, and indeed was something of a child prodigy himself. The next three images that I'm going to show you are drawings that were made by Millais when he was just 8 years old. So when we say child prodigy, we really do mean someone who had a real innate sense of how to capture images from an incredibly young age. And these are all from the Royal Academy's collection as well, so you can look at all of these online much more clearly. But the three that really stood out to me when I was having a look at them, putting this talk together, are this one, which is a copy after a Raphael drawing, which I put there on the right-hand side, so you can see that even though it does have kind of characteristics of a childhood drawing of something and a certain naivety to it, there's really the elements that he's captured are actually quite fantastic. He's understood how to use cross-hatching to great effect to create shadow and different pencil lines to create texture. When we look at the fur here on Pope Leo X's sleeves, the shadows that he's used with a softer pencil than the rest of the image to create real areas of depth and darkness absolutely stand out. And as any other 8-year-old child might, the cape of the friar to the back left, it's not just being drawn and coloured in as a flat surface. The drapery is involved in that, and the details of these tiny buttons have been included by this young artist. And so I think, you know, as I said, even though it's not a perfect drawing of the scene, it's the elements that he's captured and how he's broken down that image and reconfigured it for himself, which really do set him apart. Again, a drawing that stood out were these 3 figures at a water pump, and that was mainly for their posers, to understand how figures work together in a space to create an interesting composition is something that he was able to do again from that very young age, not just drawing sort of stick figures in a background next to a pump on one side. The depth has been suggested to us by a horizon line that's been shaded in, and by the turns and the foreshortening here of the back arm of the central figure really do show that Millet was recognised quite rightly as a child prodigy, and it's no wonder that he entered the Royal Academy School just a couple of years after these drawings were made, and is still the youngest person ever to attend. The third one picks up on most of the sort of aspects of these drawings, which I've already mentioned, using the different grades of pencil to create wonderful atmosphere and depth to images that he was capturing. But I do wonder for Millet if something quite sad and almost regretful comes through in his painting of Autumn Leaves. And to my mind, that could be his regret for his loss of his own childhood. To enter into the Royal Academy Schools at just age 11 and almost being encouraged, forced to walk down a certain path in life, and whether that affected him at all in his adulthood, as that had been cemented for him so early and in his formative years, through puberty and adolescence as well, a time of such great upheaval and change for someone personally, to have so much pressure sort of attached to you, and that almost instantaneous need to become an adult possibly could be something that he's reflecting on in this picture. Certainly with the girls' gazers, the ones holding the autumn leaves and looking directly past us, they've really got that disengagement with what's going on. And this hand in particular, for an artist so astute as Millet, is quite an odd placement in the image. If we look at the fire here, she's going to get her hand burnt. So maybe there's something in the symbolism there, and something more meaningful that play with fire, you're going to get burnt, whether there is that element of regret for the loss of his own childhood. And the figure that we have here at the front is of course holding a little apple from which she's just taken a bite. So that there again could be a reference to his losing his own innocence in childhood and taking a bite from that forbidden fruit. And I think we really get that proper sense of everything that I've said in the symbol of the pile of leaves, which we can't tell if that is a bonfire about to burn or having burnt. And that gives us an idea of the transience and the elusive nature of childhood and how that passes quite quickly, just like the seasons of autumn do. And there's sort of the fire and the apple as key indicators that I've highlighted here, so that you can see how Millet's put those right at the front of the picture in the picture space. There really are very dominant features of that painting. Everything else is recessed and pushed into the different planes, but it's the apple and the fire that are two very prominent symbols, and I think that's the reading of them for this artist. So the third artist that I'm going to throw into the mix is Evelyn de Morgan. And again, this is why I put late Victorian rather than pre-Raphaelite, because the pictures of hers from this for this presentation, her pictures regarding autumn really did happen after the turn of the century, in the early 20th century, when she had reached quite a stage of maturity in her career. She'd begun working as a practicing artist at the age of 17 when she entered the Slade School of Art, and then exhibited her first pictures not long after that. So these are paintings that she was coming to sort of halfway through her professional career, if not a bit later than that, and working right up until her death, which was in 1919. And for some of the images, it's a good idea to have that in mind, that actually the last years of her life were lived through the Great War, which brought sort of terror and death on such a huge scale to the population. So it really was something she tried to resonate through her artwork. So the cadence of autumn here, I mean, it's explicit in the title what the artist wants us to understand from her picture, and the way she uses autumn is very much as an allegory. So we have springtime here laden with fruits, the summer of plentifulness, with the two women interacting here and bagging up all of this beautiful fruit. Autumn sits with her head bowed, looking forward to winter, who sort of rises at the end of the picture here. And quite interesting, it's the cadence of autumn. So in music, that's a scale which has an ascension to it. We know that Evelyn de Morgan was a spiritualist, so she believed in the eternal nature of the human soul after the life of the body. And this picture is often linked to that spiritualism. So rather than her thinking of life as very linear, she actually thinks of it as cyclical. And that's why linking it to the seasons was such an important element of this artist's work. And we have the water wheel behind autumn linking those ideas of, you know, when this season of autumn and this calendar year is over, don't worry, because spring will come with rebirth and renewal, even if that's for the soul after the death of the body. So this idea of the eternal nature of the human soul very much addressed in this picture. Here's Evelyn de Morgan holding what we believe to be a nutmeg grater, which was often used in communication with the spirits. It's not supposedly a paintbrush, as was my first thought when I first saw the picture. And she's probably a little bit younger than she was when she painted the Cadence of Autumn in this photograph, although we don't have that dated. A young rebellious artist who really went against the grain of her family, who were upper middle class, and really didn't want her to become a professional artist, and of course of her gender. So it wasn't really the done thing for young women to become artists when she was training and first exhibiting. So maybe looking to autumn as a great season for potential and change, rather than looking at it as something dead and deathly, was particularly of importance to this artist. The autumn was also used by her to depict some mythological subjects. So they were a huge source of inspiration for her paintings, and she continued to tackle mythological subjects throughout her career. Here we have a painting from 1906 called Demeter Mourning for Persephone. And in mythology, Demeter, often perceived as a Mother Earth figure, and we see her here with the corn in her hair and the poppies falling away from her. Her daughter Persephone was sentenced to spend 6 months of the year in the underworld. So when she came up from the underworld in the spring and the summer, Demeter would celebrate and make the land fertile. And when Persephone was banished back to Hades, to the underworld, during the autumn and the winter, that's when Demeter would mourn and everything would die. I think it's quite interesting that De Morgan chooses the part of that myth where we have these kind of beautiful sunsets on the horizon. So it's definitely not the winter months that she's tackled. It certainly is that the autumn, that again, that picking up on it being a period for potential and change. Another way in which this shows De Morgan used the autumn, however, wasn't just for its symbolic meaning, but also for its aesthetic qualities. I don't really think that there's a lot in this picture that goes much further in her understanding, as some of her other paintings do, either with the title or the arrangement of the figure within that landscape, there are very few visual clues to what the subject actually is. What's more important is that billowing autumnal toned gown that the figure wears, and that effect of light on the horizon, and how it touches the clouds and creates a beautiful purple pink colour in those. And so I actually think this is a painting that can really be looked at as quite different to some of the others in De Morgan's career, as one that does really focus on the beauty of the painting itself more than any of the symbolic meaning. And the final picture that I wanted to look at today is again by Evelyn de Morgan, because it's another depiction of autumn. But for those of you familiar with her work, I think you'll agree it's once again a very different depiction of that season. It's called Boreas and the Fallen Leaves, and it's probably painted between 1910 and her death in 1919, but it's not signed or dated, so that is sort of an educated guess. Boreas was the god of the north wind, and we see him here clinging onto this tree from which he emerges, surrounded by this billowing sort of air and wind that's been drawn as these beautiful swirling draperies by the artist. And he is being sort of so aggressive towards the figures that the leaves have become personified by De Morgan as these women who can barely stand up against it. So it has been read as the force of the patriarchy against women, and that's sort of causing their downfall. Evelyn de Morgan was a feminist artist. She signed a declaration in favour of women's suffrage in 1889, and went on to marry William de Morgan, who was a great activist for the women's suffrage campaign, becoming the vice president of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage in 1914, possibly around the time that this painting was made. So I think that could be one reading of it. However, I would like to argue that a lot of this imagery could be influenced by different technological changes in society that were going on at the time. The movement and the dynamism that she creates in this image is quite different from other handlings of the subject. And one instance of that is The Golden Stairs by Edward Burne-Jones. We have that same arc of women, the interaction between them, either touching one another or looking at one another, and moving in this sort of beautiful arc, which allows the whole bodies to be used to create that movement. However, compared to De Morgan's image, it's actually quite stagnant, whereas these figures are very active and have a real movement to them. So one technological advance that could have inspired De Morgan, I'm arguing, is a Victorian children's toy called zoetrope. And as photography became such an interesting new technology to lots of Victorians, there was lots of experimentation about the potential of that. And so just wanted to show you how this device worked. So if you bear with me one second, I'm going to attempt to share a video which, as we all know, has the potential to go hugely wrong. So I hope this works. Take it for a spin. So you can see what we have here is a strip with lots of still images, and when they're put into this round drum-like tool, as she said on the video, you can see that it tricks the eye into creating a moving image. So one of the first examples of almost that flickbooks technology, which were also quite popular in this period. So that, to my mind, is the artist engaging a little bit more than we perhaps maybe consider that she would do in being able to look at technology and technological advances. And so the date of the painting then becomes quite interesting, as it aligns her more with artists such as Wyndham Lewis and the vorticists in this country. Now, vorticism was an invention of Wyndham Lewis, and it was an art movement that he founded in London in 1914. And what he really looked to do with this group is use familiar forms of representation, but create a geometric style that created a very hard-edged abstraction of figures. But all of that was in celebration of technological advancement, particularly around the war. And we can see here that this painting battery shield almost acts as propaganda for the Great War and the technology that was used within it, and how quickly that rapid development of modernity was embedded into society. I would argue that perhaps with De Morgan's painting, what we get is a real reaction to that. She uses much softer forms but retains that dynamism. And also, I think in using sort of suffering women, she's able to align those with the suffering of humankind caused by the war. This suffering human form was one that she'd actually used previously in her painting of 1899, The Valley of the Shadows. You can see the form of sort of a human figure here being stepped on, rather than being able to move forward to the light. They haven't sort of opened themselves up to religious or spiritual awakening, and they're chained or roped to the earth. So another kind of spiritual picture of De Morgan's there. And this much earlier painting of 1883, again, she uses this absolutely destitute, really emotive arrangement of the human form. You can imagine getting into that position yourself, and how difficult and hard and painful that would be. And through that, she really communicates the anguish, in this case, of exiled Jews in Babylon, who are so desperately sad of being exiled from their homelands that they can't play their instruments anymore. And this figure, to my mind, absolutely encaptures the human suffering in that painting. And so the recycling of that motif, familiar to her audience and you know, just familiar to humans, I think that this would indicate the suffering of humankind. We see three of those very similar figures arranged here as the figures fall. So perhaps a painting that really, I mean, quite sadly perhaps, looks at the period of the Great War as one of the autumn of humanity, one in which has potential for betterment on the other side and eventual peace, but also the desperate times that people are going through, and the huge loss of life and huge human suffering that the war here, as the god Boreas, has come in and forced upon society. Thank you so much. Unless there are any questions, I'm going to leave that there. And I hope you've enjoyed this sort of quite seasonal look at some late Victorian paintings. I hope that's been an interesting way to sort of investigate some of these paintings and pick out the lives of the artist and align those with that motif. Good, fascinating choices. Thank you so much, Martin. That's a lovely thing to say. I have always considered this image in particular by Evelyn De Morgan as one that needs much further investigation, and given its date, it seems wrong to align it with pre-Raphaelite painting. I think we get a lot more out of it by reading it in the vein of the Cubists, the Vorticists, and the Futurists who were working across Europe at the time of the war. Worth the wait. That's so kind. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. We'll leave it there. There's another talk this Friday at 12 o'clock, and that's a free one in collaboration with Crew's Bereavement Care, where we're going to talk about the theme of grief in Evelyn's paintings, which might be of help to people who perhaps, for people who Christmas perhaps isn't such a happy time of year. So do pass that on to anyone who's interested, or just come along to hear more about sort of what grief has meant since Evelyn De Morgan's time, and how that's dealt with by that fantastic charity Crew's Bereavement Care, who offers support for people who are dealing with grief. And I'll see you on Friday. Thank you so much. Bye bye.